You have exactly 60 seconds to realize this party isn't for you, Julian, Sophia whispered, her voice a calm, serrated blade cutting through the orchestral swell of the plaza ballroom. She didn't look like a woman whose husband had just walked in with a younger, pregnant mistress. She looked like a predator who had finally cornered her prey in a room filled with golden light and expensive witnesses. Julian didn't flinch. Instead, he laughed, the sound hollow and arrogant as he tightened his grip on Arabella Fontaine's waist. He shoved a velvet-lined box toward Sophia, but as it clicked open, it didn't reveal diamonds. It revealed a signed divorce petition and a notice of eviction. "I'm not the one leaving, Sophia," Julian sneered, his eyes darting to the wall of cameras he believed were there to document his new dynasty. "The heir clause in our prenup just kicked in. You're out." "She's in, and the best part, you're leaving this building with nothing but the dress on your back." The air in the room curdled. For 10 years, Sophia had been the silent architect of the Morty empire, the one who worked until 4:00 a.m. while Julian played the part of the charismatic titan at polo matches and gala dinners. The emotional pain of his betrayal wasn't a fresh wound. It was a cold, hardened scar that had turned into armor. She looked at Arabella, whose ruby-red dress screamed of high-stakes scandal, and then back to Julian. He wanted the world to see Sophia Morty break. He wanted a public execution of her dignity to justify his own greed. But as the crowd of Manhattan's elite leaned in, their diamonds shimmering like the eyes of vultures, Sophia didn't cry. She didn't even blink. The conflict escalated with the precision of a falling guillotine. "Did you really think I didn't see you siphoning the firm's offshore accounts to pay for Arabella's silence?" Sophia asked, her smile finally reaching her eyes, a winner's smirk that made Julian's blood run cold. Before he could respond, the massive digital displays behind the orchestra, intended to show a montage of their 10 years of bliss, flickered and died. When they roared back to life, they didn't show photos of the happy couple. They showed bank statements. They showed wire transfers. They showed the exact moment Julian Morty had used Morty Group capital to buy a penthouse for his mistress. Then came the inciting incident that shattered the Morty legacy forever. Sophia reached into her silk clutch and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope, the $30,000 summons. "The morality clause in our contract doesn't just cover fidelity, Julian. It covers felony," she said, her voice amplified by the sudden silence of the room. She pressed the papers against his chest, right over his heart. At that exact moment, the prenup voided, alert flashed in bold, crimson letters across every screen in the ballroom. The cameras Julian had invited weren't filming a celebration. They were broadcasting a corporate coup in real time. He wasn't the king of the evening, he was the evidence. As Julian's face transitioned from arrogant gold to a sickly, catastrophic gray, the literal image of total ego death, a chilling question hung in the air. If Sophia had the power to void the prenup and freeze his assets in a single heartbeat, what else had she already taken from him while he was busy playing house with Arabella? The silence that followed was heavier than the crystal chandeliers overhead. Julian looked down at the summons in his hand, his fingers trembling so violently the paper rattled. He looked at the clarity anchor on the document, the legal seal that proved Sophia hadn't just sued him, she had already replaced him. The $30,000 he had spent on the anniversary cake, the $50,000 he'd spent on the vintage champagne, and the millions he'd spent on Arabella's jewelry were all now part of a bankruptcy filing he hadn't seen coming. He was a man standing in the ruins of a life he thought he still owned. Arabella was the first to break the spell. Her V-shaped power dynamic shifted instantly. She stepped away from Julian as if his touch were toxic, her face contorting from a mask of smug triumph into one of pure, unadulterated fury. She wasn't just upset, she was panicked. She had tied her future and the future of her unborn child to a man who was currently being liquidated in front of the world's press. She pointed a manicured finger at Julian's chest, her voice a shrill contrast to Sophia's cool composure. "You told me you were the one in control. You told me she was just a figurehead." Sophia stood as the psychological anchor of the room. She adjusted her sunglasses, the dark lenses shielding her eyes from the frantic flashbulbs of the paparazzi. She looked at her husband, the man who had tried to bury her, and saw nothing but a stranger. The white suit she wore wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a flag of surrender she had forced Julian to fly. She had waited for this anniversary, not out of love, but because the 10-year mark was the exact moment the statute of limitations expired on her ability to claim 100% of the firm's intellectual property. Julian tried to speak, but his voice was a dry croak. "Sophia, we can talk about this. The board, they won't allow this." "The board is currently in the library upstairs, Julian," Sophia replied, her tone conversational, almost bored. "They've already voted. You're being removed for cause, effective 60 seconds ago." The stoplight effect was now complete. Arabella, in her high-saturation red, was the signal of a danger that had already arrived. Julian, in his dark tuxedo, was the shadow of a man fading into irrelevance. And Sophia, in her pristine white, was the clear path forward. She had turned his anniversary surprise into his professional obituary. The biological stakes of Arabella's pregnancy, which Julian had intended to use as his ultimate leverage, now felt like a lead weight. If the prenup was voided, Julian had no claim to the Morty Trust, and neither did his heirs. He had traded a multi-billion-dollar empire for a scandal he couldn't afford to settle. As two men in dark suits, federal investigators, not the private security Julian had hired, stepped out of the crowd to flank him, the room began to spin. Julian looked at the summons one last time, the $30,000 price tag of the legal maneuver finally making sense. Sophia hadn't just wanted to leave him, she wanted to erase him. She turned her back on him then, the train of her white suit sweeping across the marble floor with a sound like a long, final breath. She walked toward the center of the ballroom, where the orchestra had nervously begun to play again. She didn't look back at the man being led away in handcuffs. She didn't look back at the mistress screaming about her rights. Sophia Morty had spent a decade in the shadows, building a throne for a man who didn't deserve to sit on it. Tonight, she had simply taken it back. But as she reached the doors, she paused. She looked at the $30,000 cake, still sitting untouched and magnificent in the corner. With a small, satisfied smile, she took a single silver fork, tasted a tiny piece of the frosting, and whispered to herself, actually, it was worth every penny. The doors closed behind her, leaving the elite of Manhattan to wonder. Now that the Ice Queen had claimed her crown, who would be the first to fall in the new Morty era? The heavy mahogany doors of the plaza did more than just shut out the chaos of the ballroom. They sealed Julian Morty into the tomb of his own making. As Sophia stepped into the back of her waiting town car, the silence was absolute, a stark, chilling contrast to the decade of noise she had endured. For 10 years, Sophia had existed in a state of calculated quiet, a ghost haunting the very halls she had built. She leaned her head back against the cool leather, watching the blurred lights of Manhattan streak past the window like dying stars. People called her the Ice Queen, a woman born with a silver spoon and a heart made of frost, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know that the ice was a shield, and beneath it lay the charred remains of a woman who had once believed in something as fragile as loyalty. In the beginning, there was no Morty Empire. There was only a cramped, two-room office in the garment district that smelled of burnt coffee and desperation. Sophia could still taste the metallic tang of that era, the nights she spent living on caffeine and adrenaline, while Julian slept soundly, dreaming of the fame she was currently engineering for him. She was 24, a brilliant legal mind with a penchant for corporate structure, and he was the charming face that could sell ice to an Arctic explorer. She had been the one to draft their first investment prospectus. She was the one who stayed up until dawn, rewriting the bylaws of what would become the Morty Group, ensuring that every loophole was closed and every asset was protected. Julian had been the salesman, but Sophia had been the product. She remembered the first time she realized Julian saw her as a tool rather than a partner. It was their second anniversary. They had just landed their first multi-million-dollar contract, a deal Sophia had brokered by staying in a windowless boardroom for 36 hours straight. She had expected a quiet dinner, a moment of shared triumph. Instead, Julian had arrived home late, smelling of expensive bourbon and another woman's perfume, tossing a pair of diamond earrings onto the bed as if paying a debt. "Great job on the Miller deal, Soph," he had said, not even looking her in the eye. "The press is going to love the Julian Morty touch on this one." That was the moment the silence began. It was a slow, creeping frost that started in her fingertips and eventually reached her heart. She didn't argue, she didn't scream. She simply picked up the earrings, walked to the bathroom, and flushed them down the toilet. If Julian wanted to play the role of the singular genius, she would let him. She would build him a pedestal so high that the fall would eventually kill him. She retreated into the shadows of the firm, becoming the silent partner in the most literal sense. She handled the audits, the acquisitions, and the ironclad contracts that held their world together, all while Julian stood in the spotlight, soaking up the adulation of a city that had no idea who was actually pulling the strings. The sacrifices were not just professional, they were visceral. Sophia recalled the third year of their marriage, the year she had almost left. She had discovered the first of Julian's indiscretions, a leggy intern with wide eyes and a short skirt. Sophia had her bags packed, her hand on the door of their Fifth Avenue penthouse. But then, she looked at the papers on the foyer table, a merger agreement that was 90% complete. If she left then, the firm would collapse. Her work, her legacy, her 10,000-hour masterpiece would be dismantled by creditors. She stayed, not for him, but for the empire. She realized then that Julian was merely the tenant of the house she was building. She could evict him when the lease was up, but not a moment sooner. Over the next 7 years, Sophia perfected the art of being invisible. She watched Julian grow more arrogant, more careless. He began to believe his own press releases. He truly thought the Morty magic was his own blood, rather than the ink in Sophia's pen. He treated her like furniture, an elegant, expensive piece of decor that came with the office. He didn't notice when she started installing new forensic accounting software. He didn't notice when she began restructuring the morality clauses in the executive bylaws to include unauthorized use of corporate funds for personal hush money. He was too busy being Julian Morty to see that Sophia Morty was becoming his judge, jury, and executioner. The emotional toll of those 10 years was a weight she carried in the hollow of her throat. She had missed her father's funeral to close a deal that saved the company. She had spent her birthdays alone in the office, watching the city lights and wondering if she was becoming a monster to catch a wolf. Every time Julian brought home a new mistress, every time he mocked her frigid nature in front of his friends, Sophia simply added a new line to her ledger. She was a woman of math, and the math of his betrayal was reaching a tipping point. She had sacrificed her youth, her reputation as a soft woman, and her chance at a real family, all to ensure that when the hammer finally fell, there would be nothing left of Julian but dust. She thought of Arabella Fontaine, the girl in the red dress. Arabella was just the latest in a long line of casualties Julian had left in his wake. The girl thought she had won a prince, not realizing she had actually inherited a sinking ship. Sophia felt a flicker of something resembling pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of Julian's voice in the ballroom. "You're leaving tonight with nothing but the dress on your back." Julian had truly believed he could discard a decade of her labor like a used napkin. He had underestimated her because he couldn't imagine a woman who didn't need his validation. He thought her silence was submission, never realizing it was the sound of a fuse burning down. The $30,000 summons wasn't just a legal document, it was the bill for 10 years of her life, and Sophia was here to collect, with interest. As the car pulled up to the private terminal where her jet was waiting, Sophia looked at her reflection in the darkened glass. She was no longer the girl who had shared a cramped office in the garment district. She was the architect of a billion-dollar ghost ship, and she had just thrown the captain overboard. The silence was no longer a burden, it was her throne. She stepped out of the car, the cold night air of New York hitting her face like a benediction. For 10 years, she had been a ghost. Tonight, she was the only person in the city who was truly alive. Julian was in a holding cell, Arabella was in a panic, and the Morty group was, for the first time, exactly what it was always meant to be, hers. The doors of the plaza's grand ballroom didn't just open, they were conquered. In the world of Manhattan's elite, timing is a weapon, and Arabella Fontaine had spent her entire life learning how to sharpen the blade. The anniversary gala was supposed to be a celebration of a decade-long union, a milestone of endurance and shared history, but the moment Arabella stepped onto the threshold, she turned the entire event into a crime scene. She stood framed by the heavy gold leafing of the entryway, her presence a jarring, violent splash of ruby-red silk against the sea of Sophia's carefully curated, Morty white. It wasn't just an entrance, it was a hostile takeover of the air in the room. Sophia felt the collective intake of breath from 300 guests before she even turned around. It was a sound she knew well, the sharp, sibilant hiss of a social circle that lived for blood in the water. She watched as Julian's posture changed instantly. The husband who had spent the last hour looking at his watch suddenly stood taller, his chest expanding with a toxic brand of pride. He didn't look like a man whose wife was standing 3 feet away. He looked like a man who had just unveiled a new skyscraper. The guest list from hell had been curated by Sophia to include every major investor, every rival CEO, and every gossip columnist with a pulse, but Julian had added one name to the top of the list, the woman who was intended to be Sophia's replacement. Arabella moved through the crowd with an aggressive, leaning gait that defied the elegance of the setting. Every step was a provocation. Her dress was cut to emphasize the high stakes she was carrying, the biological leverage of a 5-month pregnancy that she wore like a badge of office. As she approached the center of the ballroom, the whispers followed her like a wake. Is that her, at the anniversary, in front of Sophia? The humiliation was designed to be atmospheric, a heavy, humid cloud of shame that Julian intended to wrap around his wife until she choked. He reached out, his hand finding Arabella's waist with a proprietary hunger, and for a moment, the three of them formed a V-shaped tableau of pure social warfare. Image the V-shaped power dynamic. Julian in the center, Arabella leaning in with predatory triumph, Sophia standing as the psychological anchor on the right. "You're late, Arabella," Julian said, his voice loud enough to carry to the front row of the orchestra. He didn't look at Sophia. He looked at the girl in the red dress, as if she were the sun and Sophia was merely the moon, a cold satellite whose time had passed. I was beginning to think the surprise would have to wait. Arabella's face was a mask of hyper-realized aggression. She wasn't content with just being the other woman. She wanted to be the only woman. She leaned into Julian's space, her finger tracing the line of his lapel, her eyes fixed on Sophia with a smug, winner's smirk that would have broken a lesser person. "The traffic was a nightmare, darling," Arabella purred, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that coats a poison pill. "But some things are worth waiting for. Don't you agree, Sophia? A legacy, for instance." The public humiliation was a masterclass in psychological architecture. Julian had invited the cameras specifically for this moment. He wanted the digital record to show Sophia's descent, the moment the Ice Queen was dethroned by a younger, fertile successor. He believed that by parading Arabella in the center of their 10th anniversary celebration, he was forcing Sophia into a corner where she would have to accept his divorce terms just to escape the burning glare of the spotlight. He was using Arabella as a friction point, a human wedge driven between Sophia and the empire they had built together. But as the flashbulbs began to pop, capturing the stoplight effect of the ruby dress against the white decor, the power dynamic began to invert. Sophia didn't flinch, she didn't retreat. She stood as the psychological anchor, her posture upright, her expression one of amused detachment. She looked at Arabella, not with anger, but with the clinical curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen that had just walked into a trap. "The dress is a bold choice, Arabella," Sophia said, her voice cutting through the tension like a diamond-tipped drill. "Red is the color of debt, isn't it? Or is it just a warning sign? I can never remember which one applies to you more." The room went cold. The guest list from hell was now witnessing a shift they hadn't expected. Julian's ego, inflated by the presence of his mistress, began to show the first hairline fractures. He had expected Sophia to wither under the weight of the scandal. He hadn't prepared for her to weaponize it. He tightened his grip on Arabella, trying to reclaim the narrative. "Sophia, let's not be gauche. We all know why we're here. The air clause is the only thing that matters now. The Morty name needs a future, and you, well, you're the past." Arabella let out a sharp, jagged laugh, her hand resting pointedly on her stomach. It was a gesture of biological stakes, a move designed to trigger Sophia's deepest insecurities. "It must be hard," Arabella whispered, loud enough for the nearby investors to hear. "Building a world you can't actually populate. Julian told me you were always more interested in spreadsheets than in being a wife. I suppose that's why he had to come to me to find a heart." The humiliation was intended to be Sophia's total ego death. But as the cameras swiveled to catch her reaction, they found a woman who was already 5 steps ahead of the game. Sophia looked at the clarity anchors Julian had unintentionally provided, the public display of his infidelity, the admission of his intent to bypass their legal agreements, and the presence of the woman he had bought with company funds. Every word Arabella spoke was being recorded, not just by the press, but by the legal team Sophia had positioned in the shadows of the mezzanine. "A heart is an expensive thing to maintain, Julian," Sophia said, her eyes finally meeting his. "Especially when you're using my money to pay for it. Did you really think I'd invite the entire board of directors to watch you commit social suicide without having a plan for the funeral?" The V-shaped dynamic was now permanent. On the left, Julian began his descent, his face starting to pale as he noticed for the first time that his lead accountant wasn't laughing. In the center, Arabella's fury began to mask a growing panic. She was realizing that the winner's smirk she had practiced in the mirror was being met with a level of control she couldn't comprehend. And on the right, Sophia remained the anchor, the woman in white who had turned a guest list from hell into a jury of her peers. The public humiliation was over, but not for the woman Sophia intended to destroy. As the music resumed, a haunting, rhythmic cello piece that sounded like a ticking clock, the room realized that the anniversary wasn't a celebration of a marriage. It was the public opening of a litigation that would leave only one Morty standing. Sophia turned her back on the pair, her white suit a beacon of cold authority. She had allowed Arabella to make her grand entrance, allowed her to scream her triumph to the rafters, because she knew that the higher they climbed on their pedestal of lies, the more spectacular the crash would be. The trap wasn't just set, it was currently being sprung. "Enjoy the champagne, Arabella," Sophia said over her shoulder, her voice a final, chilling tease. "It's the last thing Julian will ever be able to afford." The air in the plaza's private library smelled of old leather, expensive scotch, and the distinct, metallic scent of an impending execution. Julian Morty stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Manhattan splayed out behind him like a conquered kingdom. He had pulled Sophia away from the prying eyes of the ballroom, dragging her into this sanctum of mahogany and silence to deliver what he believed was the final blow. Arabella stood by the door, her ruby-red dress a vibrant wound against the dark wood, her arms crossed over her stomach in a gesture that was half protection, half propaganda. Julian turned, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand, his face settled into a mask of smug, absolute certainty. "You always were a brilliant architect, Sophia," Julian began, his voice dropping into that smooth, baritone register he used when closing a deal. He didn't look like a man who had just been publicly confronted. He looked like a man who had already won. "You built the walls, you laid the foundation, and you even picked the furniture. But you forgot one thing, I'm the one who owns the land." He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, letting the silence stretch between them until it felt like a physical weight. "You think that little scene downstairs changed anything? You think a few bank statements and some whispered rumors can topple me? You've clearly spent too much time in the basement with the accountants and not enough time reading the documents you actually signed." Sophia leaned against a heavy oak desk, her white suit gleaming under the dim library lights. She didn't look defeated, she looked patient. "I've read every document in this firm's history, Julian. I'm the one who drafted them, remember." Julian's laugh was a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the leather-bound books. "And that was your first mistake. You were so focused on protecting the company from outsiders that you left the back door wide open for the man sitting across the breakfast table from you." He set his glass down on a side table with a definitive thud and pulled a thin, leather-bound folder from the desk drawer. He tossed it toward her. "Section 14, paragraph C, the morality and succession clause." "Go ahead, Sophia, refresh your memory. It's the foolproof plan you gave me on our wedding day." Sophia didn't reach for the folder. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what was written there. She had written it during a time when she thought Morty was a name she could wear with pride. "The clause states," Julian continued, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light, "that in the event of a divorce, the party who has failed to provide a viable heir to the Morty estate forfeits 70% of their equity. Furthermore, if that party is found to be in breach of the image and reputation standard, say, by causing a public scandal at a milestone event, their remaining 30% is liquidated and transferred to the active partner. In this case, that's me. He gestured toward Arabella, who smiled with a chilling, triumphant sweetness. Arabella is carrying the future of this company. You, Sophia, are a biological and social dead end. By making a scene tonight, you didn't save yourself. You triggered the very mechanism that strips you of everything. The V-shaped power dynamic in the room was suffocating. Julian was the peak, the man holding the legal gavel. Arabella was the friction, the physical proof of Sophia's failure. And Sophia sat at the bottom of the descent, or so Julian thought. He paced the room, the adrenaline of the kill making his movements jerky and energetic. He was experiencing the ultimate ego high, the belief that he had successfully used Sophia's own brilliance as a cage to trap her. I've already had the board's legal counsel review the standing, Julian boasted, leaning over the desk to get into Sophia's personal space. The moment I file those papers tomorrow morning, the freeze on your assets becomes permanent. The penthouse, mine. The Hamptons estate, mine. The controlling shares in Morty Real Estate, all mine. You'll be lucky if I let you keep your maiden name, because you certainly won't be taking any of my money with you. You want to play the martyr tonight? Fine. But martyrs don't get alimony, they just get buried. Arabella stepped forward, her voice a soft, mocking purr. It's nothing personal, Sophia, it's just business. Julian needs a partner who can give him a legacy, not just a ledger. You've been a wonderful caretaker for his fortune, but the house is under new management now. Maybe you can find a nice, quiet firm in Jersey to take you in. I hear they're always looking for experienced help. The public humiliation Julian had orchestrated downstairs was nothing compared to the cold, calculated cruelty of this room. He truly believed he had found the ultimate loophole. He had spent months consulting with high-priced attorneys behind Sophia's back, feeding them redacted versions of their marriage contract, seeking a way to divorce her without losing the multi-billion-dollar empire she had built. The morality clause was his crown jewel. By framing Sophia as the unstable wife who couldn't conceive and who chose to attack her husband publicly on their anniversary, he was painting a picture of a woman in breach of her contractual duties to the Morty brand. You see, Sophia, Julian whispered, his face inches from hers, I didn't bring Arabella here tonight just to hurt you. I brought her here to activate the clause. I needed a public record of your instability. I needed the cameras to catch you looking like a scorned, vengeful woman. Every flashbulb downstairs was a nail in your professional coffin. You walked right into it. You were so busy looking for my mistakes that you forgot I was the one holding the leash. He stood back up, straightening his tuxedo jacket with an air of finality. The total ego death he intended for Sophia was supposed to happen right now. He expected her to crumble. He expected her to beg for a settlement, to offer him her shares in exchange for a quiet exit. He waited for the mask of the Ice Queen to crack and reveal the desperate woman underneath. But Sophia just looked at him, her expression as unreadable as a blank check. She didn't look at the folder. She didn't look at Arabella. She simply looked at the clock on the library wall. Is that it, Julian? Sophia asked, her voice shockingly calm. Is that the entirety of your master plan, a succession clause and a pregnant mistress? Julian's smile faltered for the briefest of seconds. It's enough to leave you with nothing. It's ironclad. Ironclad is a dangerous word for a man who doesn't understand metallurgy, Sophia said, standing up and smoothing the front of her white suit. She walked toward the door, her movements graceful and unhurried. You're right about one thing, Julian. The morality clause is very specific, but there's a sub-clause you seem to have overlooked, one that deals with the origin of assets used to fund the heir. She paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. She didn't turn back, but her voice filled the room with a cold, terrifying clarity. You think you've trapped me in my own contract? Julian, I didn't write that contract to protect the company from outsiders. I wrote it to protect the company from you. And tomorrow morning, when the sun comes up, you're going to find out exactly what happens when the landlord discovers his tenant has been burning the floorboards for heat. She opened the door and stepped back into the golden light of the hallway, leaving Julian and Arabella in the shadows of the library. The clarity anchor had been dropped, but Julian was too blinded by his own perceived victory to see the rope tightening around his neck. He thought he had delivered the final word, but Sophia knew the real conversation hadn't even started yet. The V-shaped power dynamic was about to undergo a violent, irreversible inversion. Julian was standing at the top of a mountain made of sand, and the tide was coming in faster than he could ever run. The revenge Julian saw tonight wasn't born in the ballroom. It was forged 18 months ago in the sterile blue light of a basement home office at 3:00 a.m. While Julian was likely at a rooftop bar in Tribeca, toasted by the laughter of sycophants, Sophia was staring at a discrepancy that shouldn't have existed. It was a decimal point, a tiny, insignificant dot in a sea of corporate numbers that refused to align. In the world of Morty real estate, a decimal point wasn't a mistake, it was a confession. Sophia remembered the exact chill that swept through the room as she traced that single error back through 3 shell companies. She had been looking for a tax optimization strategy, but what she found was a leak. It started small, $5,000 here for consulting, $10,000 there for luxury site scouting. But as she dug deeper, the numbers grew teeth. The site scouting was for a boutique hotel in the Maldives where Julian had allegedly been for a solo retreat. The consulting fees were being paid to a holding company called Rose and Vine LLC. The name Rose and Vine had piqued her interest. It was too poetic for a construction firm, too soft for a legal entity. Sophia, ever the architect of data, didn't confront him. She didn't throw her laptop across the room or wake him up to demand answers. She simply opened a new, encrypted folder on her private server and titled it, The Final Audit. That was the night Sophia stopped being a wife and became a hunter. 4 weeks after the first discovery, the paper trail led her to a high-rise in Chelsea. She had used the company's GPS tracking on Julian's executive transport to find the address. She sat in the back of a nondescript yellow cab, watching through the rain-streaked window as Julian exited the building. He wasn't alone. He was holding the hand of a girl who looked like she'd been filtered through an Instagram lens, young, vibrant, and wearing a coat that cost more than a junior associate's annual salary. Arabella Fontaine. But it wasn't the sight of her husband's infidelity that made Sophia's blood turn to ice. It was the realization of the timing. The bank transfers from the Morty Group to Rose and Vine, Arabella's shell company, aligned perfectly with the firm's quarterly shortfalls. Julian wasn't just cheating on her, he was stealing from the very empire she had bled to build. He was using Sophia's labor to fund his own replacement. The paper trail became her religion. Every morning, Sophia would kiss Julian goodbye, smelling the faint, lingering scent of Arabella's perfume on his collar, and every morning she would spend 8 hours documenting his theft. She discovered that Julian had been using the company's emergency capital fund as his personal piggy bank. He had convinced himself that since he was the CEO, the money was his to move. He hadn't realized that the bylaws Sophia drafted 10 years ago defined unauthorized asset diversion as a criminal breach of fiduciary duty. One Tuesday in November, Sophia sat in her office at the Morty Tower, the sun setting behind the Empire State Building, and looked at a purchase agreement she had intercepted. Julian had bought a penthouse under the Rose and Vine name. The down payment, $2 million, pulled directly from the firm's employee pension hedge. That was the moment Sophia, Ice Queen persona, became permanent. The emotional pain was a luxury she couldn't afford. If she let herself feel the betrayal, she would be weak. If she remained a ghost in the machine, she would be invincible. She began a series of silent restructures. She moved the firm's intellectual property, the designs, the patents, the proprietary algorithms, into a separate trust that required dual signatures for any modification. Julian signed the paperwork without looking, distracted by a text message from Arabella. He thought he was signing a routine tax form. He was actually signing away the keys to the kingdom. The most damning piece of evidence, however, came 6 months before the anniversary. Sophia had gained access to Julian's private cloud. In the midst of thousands of self-indulgent photos and business memos, she found the morality clause folder. Julian had been working with a rogue attorney to find a way to trigger the succession clause. He had been planning his anniversary surprise for half a year. He wanted to claim Sophia was mentally unstable, using her long hours and social withdrawal he had caused, as evidence that she was unfit to lead. Sophia sat in the dark of her study, reading her husband's emails to his lawyer. Once the anniversary hits, Julian had written, she'll be so blindsided by the news of the baby that she'll crumble in front of the board. The morality clause will do the rest. I'll have the firm, the kid, and the legacy. She'll have the memories. Sophia didn't cry. Instead, she took a screenshot. She then did something Julian never expected. She leaked the information to herself. She created a trail of anonymous whistleblower reports within the firm, documenting the embezzlement Julian thought he was hiding. By the time the anniversary gala arrived, the paper trail was no longer just a collection of files, it was a noose. She had spent months watching him play the part of the devoted, if slightly distant, husband. She sat through dinners where he talked about their bright future, knowing all the while he was counting the days until he could discard her. Every time he touched her, she felt a surge of revulsion so strong it made her teeth ache, but she remained the psychological anchor. She was waiting for the clock to strike midnight on their 10th year. She needed the anniversary to happen because the 10-year milestone in their original contract activated a specific override. After a decade, any breach of trust by a majority shareholder resulted in an immediate, non-negotiable transfer of voting rights to the aggrieved party. Julian thought he was using the anniversary to bury her. Sophia was using the anniversary to finalize the audit. The $30,000 summons Julian held in the library wasn't just a divorce paper. It was the culmination of 547 days of forensic investigation. It was the weight of every dollar he had stolen, every lie he had told, and every night Sophia had spent alone in the dark, counting the cost of his ego. The paper trail was the only bridge left between her past and her future, and as she walked out of that library, she was ready to burn it behind her. Julian had been so proud of his foolproof plan. He had been so sure that Arabella's pregnancy was the ultimate trump card. He never realized that in the game of power, a heartbeat is no match for a ledger. Sophia had documented the death of their marriage in spreadsheets and wire transfers, and now the bill was finally due. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a cathedral of light and lies, and Sophia Morty was ready to pull the trigger on the demolition. As she stepped out of the library and back onto the mezzanine, the sound of the orchestra swelled, a frantic, triumphant violin concerto that felt like the heartbeat of a dying animal. Below her, the 300 guests, the wolves of Wall Street and the vultures of Park Avenue, were still nursing their champagne, unaware that the air in the room had already turned toxic. Julian was down there, standing near the three-tiered, $30,000 anniversary cake, laughing as he accepted congratulations for a decade of a marriage he had already discarded. Arabella stood at his side, her ruby dress glowing like a warning flare under the chandeliers. Sophia descended the marble staircase with the slow, deliberate grace of a general surveying a battlefield. She didn't look like a woman who had just been threatened with poverty in a private library. She looked like a woman who was about to redefine the word collateral. Every eye in the room followed her white suit as it cut through the crowd. The V-shaped, power dynamic Julian had tried to establish was about to be shattered by a horizontal line of cold, hard truth. Julian saw her approaching and signaled to the band to stop. He wanted the silence. He wanted the room to focus on him as he delivered his final, public blow. He picked up a silver spoon and tapped it against a crystal flute, the sound ringing out like a funeral bell. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues," Julian announced, his voice booming with the practiced confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. 10 years. They say a decade is a lifetime in this city, and standing here tonight with Sophia, I can honestly say it has been an education. A ripple of polite, knowing laughter moved through the crowd. Julian looked at Sophia, his eyes cold and predatory. But every education must come to an end. Tonight, we aren't just celebrating the past. We are celebrating the future of the Morty Group, a future that requires new blood, new energy, and a new direction. He raised his glass, nodding toward Arabella, who beamed with a terrifying, triumphant glow. The guests exchanged glances, the scent of a scandal more intoxicating than the vintage Bollinger. Julian was effectively announcing his mistress and his heir in the same breath he used to toast his wife. It was the ultimate glass ceiling moment, the point where he believed Sophia would finally hit her limit and shatter. "To the next 10 years," Julian declared. "May they be as profitable as the last, and may the Morty name finally have the air it deserves." The silence that followed was suffocating, but before anyone could drink, Sophia stepped into the center of the circle. She didn't have a glass. She had a heavy, cream-colored envelope. "A beautiful toast, Julian," Sophia said, her voice clear and amplified by the hush of the room. "But you're right about one thing. This is an education, and the lesson for tonight is the cost of breach." She reached out and laid the envelope directly on top of the $30,000 cake, the heavy vellum sinking into the pristine white frosting. "What is this, Sophia?" Julian hissed, his smile finally cracking. "Don't make a scene, we talked about this." "We did talk, Julian, but you were listening to the sound of your own voice, as usual," Sophia replied. She turned to face the crowd, her gaze landing on the chairman of the board and the lead counsel for the firm's primary investors. "Members of the board, if you'll check your tablets, you'll find an emergency filing sent exactly 60 seconds ago. It's a formal notice of a morality clause breach, not by me, but by the CEO." The room erupted. In an instant, the gala transformed from a celebration into a crime scene. Waiters froze in place as the elite of Manhattan began frantically pulling out their phones. Julian's face went from smug gold to a sickly, mottled gray. He snatched the envelope off the cake, his fingers smeared with frosting as he tore it open. Inside wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a $30,000 summons, the exact cost of the cake he was standing next to detailing the embezzlement Sophia had uncovered 18 months ago. But there was more. Attached to the summons were the wire transfer receipts from Rose and Vine LLC, proving that Julian had used corporate funds to pay for the very mistress who was currently standing on his arm. "This is a lie," Julian shouted, his voice cracking as he looked at the board members. "This is a vengeful woman trying to claw back a marriage she couldn't maintain." "It's not a lie, Julian. It's a deposition," Sophia said, her winner's smirk finally appearing. "The cameras you invited, they aren't just for social media. They're currently broadcasting this live to our European investors. And since you've used company capital to fund a personal heir, you've triggered the succession void I wrote into the bylaws 10 years ago." Arabella stepped forward, her face a mask of fury. "You can't do this. I'm carrying his child. That child is the Morty legacy." Sophia looked at Arabella with a chilling pity. "That child is the evidence, Arabella. Under New York corporate law, any asset produced through the use of embezzled funds can be frozen during litigation, including trust funds, including penthouses, including your future." The total ego death was visible on Julian's face. He looked around the room and saw not friends, but witnesses. He saw the board members turning their backs on him. He saw the security detail, men he thought were on his payroll, moving toward him with expressions of grim professionalism. The glass ceiling hadn't just shattered, it had turned into a million shards of sharp, jagged reality. "The gala is over, Julian," Sophia said, stepping back as the lead investigator for the SEC, who had been posing as a guest, stepped forward. "But don't worry, I've made sure the police have plenty of cake for the precinct. After all, you've already paid for it." As the first set of handcuffs clicked shut in the middle of the plaza ballroom, the crowd began to scatter like rats from a sinking ship. Julian was led away, his tuxedo rumpled, his mistress screaming about her rights, and his empire dissolving into a series of legal filings. Sophia stood alone in the center of the debris, her white suit unstained. She didn't look at the man she had spent 10 years building. She looked at the cake, now ruined and collapsing under the weight of her summons. She had promised him a night he would never forget. And as the flashbulbs continued to pop, capturing the exact moment the Morty King was dethroned, Sophia realized she had never felt lighter. The glass was gone, the ceiling was open, and for the first time in a decade, Sophia Morty could finally see the sky. The air in the back of the precinct-bound transport was a far cry from the sandalwood-scented heights of the plaza. It smelled of ozone, stale coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold sweat. Arabella Fontaine sat as far from Julian as the cramped seating would allow, her ruby-red dress looking like a fresh wound in the dim, flickering light of the cabin. For months, this woman had been a portrait of serene, pregnant triumph, a living monument to Julian's virility and his future. But as the reality of the Morty liquidation began to sink in, the mask of the devoted lover didn't just slip, it disintegrated. Julian was staring at his hands, his fingers still stained with a smear of white frosting from the cake that had carried his downfall. He looked smaller, the total ego death manifesting in a hollowed-out expression and a slight tremor in his jaw. "It's a mistake, Arabella," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "Sophia is bluffing. She can't freeze the personal accounts. Once my lawyers get in front of the judge, we'll move the funds to the offshore trust in your name. We still have the penthouse. We still have the life I promised you." Arabella didn't answer with words. She answered with a laugh that sounded like glass breaking under a boot. She turned to look at him, and for the first time, Julian saw the eyes of the woman he had traded his empire for. They weren't soft with maternal glow. They were hard, calculating, and predatory. The friction point of their relationship had reached its ignition temperature. "The penthouse, Julian," Arabella hissed, her voice a low, jagged rasp. "Did you miss the part where the Fed served a seizure warrant on the Chelsea address, or the part where Sophia proved the down payment came from a pension hedge? That's not a penthouse anymore. It's a crime scene, and I'm not spending my third trimester in a federal holding cell because you were too stupid to hide your tracks from your own wife." Image Arabella leaning away from Julian, her face contorted in a mask of fury panic, her finger pointing at his chest. Julian recoiled as if she had struck him. "I did this for us. I built that Rose and Vine shell company to ensure you and the baby would never want for anything. I risked everything to give you the Morty legacy." "The Morty legacy is a debt-ridden ghost ship, you fool," Arabella snapped, her hand resting on her stomach not out of affection, but as if checking the value of a declining asset. "I didn't sign up for the struggle. I didn't spend 18 months playing the doting mistress to a man twice my age just to end up as a co-defendant in an embezzlement suit. You told me you were the architect. You told me Sophia was just a high-priced clerk who signed what you told her to sign. You lied to me, Julian. You're not a titan. You're a thief who got caught by a better player." The biological stakes that had been Julian's ultimate leverage now felt like a curse. He reached out to touch her arm, a desperate, instinctive gesture for comfort, but Arabella pulled back with such violence that her silk sleeve tore against the seat's metal frame. The stoplight effect was in its final stage. The red of her dress no longer signaled the passion of a new family, but the extreme danger of her betrayal. "Don't touch me," she warned, her eyes darting to the partition where the investigators sat. "I've already spoken to my own counsel while we were being processed. If you think I'm going down for your creative accounting, you're even more delusional than I thought. That shell company, Rose and Vine, I'm going to tell them you forced me to sign those papers. I'm going to tell them I had no idea where the money was coming from. I was just a young, vulnerable woman seduced by a powerful man, right? That's the narrative the press will love." Julian's mouth hung open, the betrayal hitting him harder than the handcuffs ever could. "You're going to turn on me after everything I gave you, the jewelry, the cars, the life. I bought you that coat you're wearing with funds I'm going to prison for." "Then you should have bought a better coat, Julian, because this one is going to be sold to pay for my defense," Arabella retorted, her true colors bleeding through every word. "You think I love you? You're a means to an end, or you were. Now you're just a liability. I'm the one carrying the only thing left of the Morty name that isn't under a court-ordered freeze, and I will use this child to secure my immunity before I let you drag me into the dirt with you." The power dynamic had fully inverted. Julian, the man who had walked into the plaza feeling like a king, was now being dismantled by the very woman he had chosen as his queen. Arabella wasn't a partner. She was a scavenger who had found a carcass and was now picking the bones clean before the other predators arrived. As the transport pulled into the underground garage of the federal building, Arabella adjusted her hair, her face settling into a mask of practiced, victimized innocence. She looked at Julian one last time, her gaze cold and dismissive. "By the way," she whispered as the doors opened, "the baby, I'm naming him after my father, not you. You don't get a legacy, Julian. You don't even get a footnote." She stepped out of the vehicle before he could respond, her head held high, already signaling to the waiting lawyers. Julian sat in the shadows of the cabin, the silence of the van closing in on him like a tomb. He had destroyed a 10-year marriage for a woman who wouldn't even give him a name. He had traded a loyal architect for a hungry ghost. On the right side of the visual narrative, Sophia was likely already at home, sipping tea and watching the stocks stabilize. In the center, Arabella was already negotiating her exit strategy. And on the left, Julian Morty was finally, truly alone. The billionaire was gone. There was only a man in a rumpled suit, realizing that the air clause he had been so proud of had just become the final nail in his coffin. The true colors of his mistress had been the most expensive thing Julian ever bought, and as he was led toward the booking desk, he realized he was still paying for them. The gala was over, the cake was in the trash, and the mistress was his fiercest enemy. The Morty era hadn't just ended, it had been erased. The morning sun over Manhattan was a cold, indifferent gold. Filtering through the reinforced glass of the holding center, where Julian Morty had spent the last 12 hours. He sat across from his lead counsel, Marcus Vane, a man whose hourly rate usually guaranteed a miracle, but whose face currently looked like a map of a disaster zone. Between them lay a single sheet of paper, the clarity anchor that would either be Julian's life raft or the anchor that dragged him to the bottom of the Atlantic. Julian's eyes were bloodshot, his silk shirt wrinkled, and his arrogance replaced by a frantic, vibrating desperation. "Explain it to me again, Marcus," Julian rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. "The prenup is ironclad. Sophia signed it. I signed it. It says that in the event of a divorce, we walk away with what we brought in. I brought in the Morty name. I brought in the initial capital. She can't just take the firm because of a public scene." Marcus Vane didn't look up from the document. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers tracing a specific line in Section 9. "Julian, you're not listening. This isn't about the divorce anymore. This is about the funding. Sophia didn't just sue you for divorce. She filed a motion to rescind based on a material breach of the foundational trust." He finally looked up, and for the first time in 10 years, Julian saw pity in the lawyer's eyes. "The prenup you've been relying on was voided the second you authorized that $2 million wire transfer to Rose and Vine LLC. Julian shook his head, a ghost of a scoff escaping his lips. "That doesn't make sense. The money was a draw against my future earnings. It's a common practice. At worst, it's a civil dispute over accounting." "It's not an accounting dispute when the funds used to secure the mistress were technically commingled marital assets under the 2018 Restructuring Act, the act Sophia drafted," Marcus explained, his voice dropping to a low, grim tone. "By using company capital to buy Arabella's silence and her penthouse, you committed what the law calls fraudulent concealment. Under the specific terms of the Morty prenuptial agreement, any act of fraud committed against the corporate entity by one spouse results in a nullification of protections. In plain English, Julian, the prenup died the moment you hit send on that transfer 18 months ago." This was Julian's clarity anchor moment. The world didn't just shift, it dissolved. He realized with a sickening thud in his chest that Sophia hadn't just been a victim of his affair. She had been the architect of his trap. She had known about the embezzlement for over a year. She had watched him move the money, watched him build the Rose and Vine shell company, and stayed silent because she needed him to cross the threshold of criminal fraud to trigger the nullification. "She let me do it," Julian whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "She saw the transfers. She saw the penthouse purchase. She could have stopped me, Marcus. She could have filed a corporate grievance months ago." "She didn't want a grievance, Julian. She wanted the firm," Marcus said, leaning back and closing the folder. "By staying silent, she allowed you to accrue enough bad faith points to void every single protection you had. Because the prenup is now voided, the court defaults to community property and equitable distribution. But because your contribution to the marriage has been defined as destructive and fraudulent, the judge has already granted a preliminary injunction. Sophia isn't just getting half. She's getting the whole thing as restitution for the damages you've caused to the Morty brand." Julian felt the total ego death finalize its grip. He looked at the paper on the table. The document that proved his foolproof plan was actually his death warrant. He had spent 10 years thinking he was the king, never realizing he was merely a tenant in a house Sophia had built, furnished, and was now foreclosing on. The V-shaped power dynamic was no longer a theory. It was his new reality. He was at the bottom of the descent, and the walls were closing in. "The heir," Julian stammered, his mind grasping for the last piece of leverage he thought he had. The child Arabella is carrying, surely that counts for something? The succession clause. The succession clause relied on the prenup being valid. Julian, Marcus interrupted, his voice cold. No prenup, no succession clause, and since Arabella has already signed a cooperation agreement with the district attorney in exchange for immunity, she's testified that you coerced her into the financial arrangement. The child is no longer a Morty heir. The child is a legal liability. Sophia has already petitioned to have the Morty name removed from any birth certificate resulting from that union, citing the brand integrity clause. The clarity anchor was now fully submerged. Julian looked around the grey, windowless room and realized he had traded $1 billion legacy, a brilliant wife, and a decade of work for a woman who had betrayed him in hours and a legal technicality that had turned his life into a crime scene. He had thought he was the smartest man in the room, but he had been playing checkers while Sophia was playing three-dimensional chess with the soul of the company. "What's left?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do I have left, Marcus?" Marcus Vane stood up, picking up his briefcase. He didn't look at his client as he moved toward the door. "You have a public defender, Julian. I've just been informed that the firm's retainer for my services was paid through a subsidiary that Sophia reclaimed this morning. I'm no longer authorized to represent you." The heavy steel door clicked shut, leaving Julian in a silence so profound it felt like the weight of the ocean. On the right side of the narrative, Sophia was likely standing in the boardroom of the Morty Tower, the sun hitting the glass as she was sworn in as the sole chairperson. In the center, Arabella was in a safe house, already planning her next move. And on the left, Julian Morty sat in the dark, finally understanding the true cost of his anniversary gift. The prenup wasn't just voided, it was a ghost, and Julian was the only one left to haunt the ruins. The clarity anchor had done its job. It had shown him exactly where he stood. Nowhere. The courtroom was a theater of cold marble and high-back oak, designed to make a man feel small long before the judge ever spoke. For Julian Morty, the space felt less like a hall of justice and more like a slaughterhouse. He sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, the V-shaped power dynamic of the room now physically manifest. To his left, the empty seats where his friends once sat were a silent indictment. To his right, Arabella Fontaine sat behind the prosecution's barrier, her ruby-red dress replaced by a calculated, modest charcoal maternity suit, a costume change that signaled her final pivot from mistress to state witness. But it was the center of the room that held the gravity. Sophia Morty sat at the plaintiff's table, draped in a cream-colored silk suit that looked like liquid gold under the fluorescent lights. She didn't look back at Julian. She didn't have to. She was the psychological anchor, the silent storm that had already uprooted his life. The total ego death wasn't a sudden event. It was a rhythmic dismantling, one piece of evidence at a time. "The court calls Sophia Morty to the stand," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing like a gavel strike. As Sophia stood, the cameras in the gallery, the same cameras Julian had once invited to witness his triumph, whirred into action. The public humiliation was now global. This was the clarity anchor for the world to see. Julian Morty wasn't a titan being persecuted. He was a petty thief being exposed. "Mrs. Morty," the lead prosecutor began, stepping into the well of the court. "You've presented the court with 18 months of forensic data. Can you explain the significance of the Rose and Vine ledger?" Sophia adjusted the microphone, her voice cool and resonant. "The ledger isn't just a record of theft, it's a record of intent. My husband didn't just move money to fund a lifestyle for his mistress. He moved money to create a separate reality where the Morty Group didn't belong to its shareholders, but to his own ego. He believed that by siphoning capital into offshore accounts, he could trigger a succession clause that would effectively delete my contribution to the firm." Julian felt the bile rise in his throat. Every word she spoke was a scalpel, peeling back the layers of his foolproof plan until there was nothing left but the raw, ugly truth. He looked at the judge, a man with eyes like flint, and realized that the morality clause he had tried to weaponize was now the very noose around his neck. "And what of the claim that you were unstable?" the prosecutor asked, leaning against the mahogany rail. Sophia turned her head slightly, her gaze finally grazing Julian's. It wasn't a look of anger, it was the look a gardener gives a weed they've already pulled. Julian's definition of instability was my refusal to ignore his incompetence. He mistook my silence for weakness. He mistook my focus for absence. He spent 10 years looking for a flaw in my character, never realizing that the biggest flaw in the Morty legacy was standing in front of a mirror. A ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery. The stoplight effect was in full play. Julian, in his dark, shadowed corner of the defense table, was the signal of a dead end. Arabella, the friction point, sat in the middle, her testimony already having painted Julian as a man who coerced her into a financial fraud. And Sophia, in her pristine white gold suit, was the green light, the only person left with the moral and legal authority to lead. The climax of the total ego death came when the prosecution played the audio from the library. The recording Sophia had made the night of the anniversary. Julian's own voice filled the courtroom, arrogant, cruel, and dripping with a disdain that now sounded like a suicide note. "You're leaving tonight with nothing but the dress on your back. Arabella is carrying the future. You, Sophia, are a biological and social dead end." Hearing his own words in the cold light of a courtroom was the final blow. Julian put his head in his hands, his fingers digging into his scalp. He could feel the eyes of the city on him, the investors who would never take his calls, the board members who had already voted to erase his name from the building, and the woman who had truly built the empire he had tried to steal. "Mr. Morty," the judge said, his voice cutting through the recording like a blade, "do you have anything to say before this court rules on the immediate transfer of voting rights?" Julian stood up, his legs feeling like water. He looked at Sophia, searching for a spark of the woman who had once loved him, the woman who had shared that cramped office in the garment district. But he found nothing. The Ice Queen had done her job. She had frozen him out of his own life. I did what I thought was necessary for the legacy," Julian stammered, his voice a pathetic shadow of the boom it had once been. "I wanted to ensure the Morty name continued." "The Morty name is continuing, Mr. Morty," the judge replied, his gavel hovering over the bench. "It just doesn't belong to you anymore." Greg. The sound of the gavel was a thunderclap that signaled the end of Julian's world. The total ego death was complete. In a single motion, the judge ordered the permanent nullification of the prenuptial agreement, the seizure of all assets tied to Rose and Vine LLC, and the immediate appointment of Sophia Morty as the sole conservator of the Morty Group's assets pending criminal trial. Julian was led out of the courtroom not in a blaze of glory, but in a haze of shame. As he passed Sophia, she didn't even look up from the documents her legal team was handing her. She was already moving on. She was already restructuring. She was already the titan she was always meant to be. The courtroom battle was over, and the winner was the only one who hadn't been fighting for greed, but for the integrity of the work itself. Julian Morty entered the building as a billionaire. He left it as a defendant with nothing but a rumpled suit and the echoes of his own arrogance. On the right side of the visual narrative, Sophia was surrounded by the press, her winner's smirk a testament to a decade of calculated patience. In the center, Arabella was being escorted out a side door, her immunity deal her only prize. And on the left, Julian Morty watched from the back of a police van as the Morty Tower faded into the distance, the building he thought he owned, now a monument to the woman he had tried to destroy. The glass walls of the penthouse office at the Morty Tower didn't just overlook Manhattan, they seemed to hold the city in a cold, shimmering embrace. It was 2:00 a.m., the same hour Sophia had discovered the first decimal point of Betrayal 18 months ago. But tonight, the blue light of the monitor was replaced by the warm, golden glow of a city that finally knew her name. Sophia Morty, now simply Sophia Sterling, having reclaimed her maiden name with the stroke of a judge's pen, stood by the window, a glass of vintage Bollinger in her hand. The V-shaped power dynamic that had governed her life for a decade had finally collapsed into a single, vertical line of absolute authority. On her desk lay the final decree. Julian was gone, moved to a minimum security facility upstate to begin his 5-year sentence for corporate embezzlement and fraud. Arabella Fontaine had vanished into the witness protection-adjacent obscurity of a quiet settlement in the Midwest, her true colors having earned her a life of modest comfort but zero influence. The friction point was smoothed over, the scandal had settled into a cautionary tale for the Forbes 500, and the total ego death of Julian Morty was complete. Sophia was no longer the shadow, she was the sun. She took a slow sip of the champagne, the bubbles sharp and clean against her palate. For 10 years, she had been the silent architect, the woman who built the cathedral while another man took the tithes. She had spent 3,650 days balancing Julian's ego against the firm's survival. She had been the psychological anchor for a marriage that was actually a crime scene. But as she looked at her reflection in the glass, she didn't see the ice queen the press loved to describe. She saw a woman who had finally stepped out of the blueprints and into the light. The silence of the office was the most expensive thing she owned. It wasn't the silence of being ignored or the silence of a ghost. It was the silence of a commander before a new campaign. On the mahogany desk, the same desk where Julian had tossed his foolproof morality clause, sat a new set of incorporation papers. Sterling Global. She was stripping the Morty name from the building, from the letterhead, and from her life. She was erasing the man who had tried to erase her. She remembered the way Julian had looked in the courtroom, hunched, broken, his winner's smirk, replaced by a dazed stare of catastrophic realization. He had truly believed that a pregnancy and a legal technicality could negate a decade of her labor. He had underestimated the clarity anchor of her intelligence. He had looked at her for 10 years and only saw a wife, never realizing he was looking at his most dangerous competitor. Sophia walked back to the desk and picked up a small, silver-framed photograph she had kept in a drawer for years. It was the only photo of them from the early days, the garment district office, both of them covered in dust and hope. She looked at Julian's young face, full of a charm that hadn't yet curdled into arrogance. She felt a brief, flickering ghost of a sensation, not love, but an acknowledgement of the girl she had been when she took that photo. That girl was gone, traded for the woman who now owned the skyline. With a steady hand, Sophia walked to the shredder in the corner and watched as the last vestige of the Mortys turned into thin, white ribbons of confetti. The transformation was absolute. The stoplight effect had reached its final state. The red of the mistress's betrayal was a memory. The yellow of Julian's caution-blind greed was a closed file, and Sophia was the green light, the sole architect of a legacy that didn't require a husband or an heir to be valid. She was the one who had written the contracts, and she was the one who had finally enforced them. The phone on her desk buzzed, a text from her lead counsel. The rebranding is 100% complete. The signs go up at dawn. Sophia smiled. It was the winner's smirk, but it wasn't smug. It was satisfied. She thought of the $30,000 cake, the ruby-red dress, and the heir clause that had been intended to be her undoing. Julian had brought another lady to their anniversary, but he hadn't realized that Sophia had brought the law, the truth, and the future. She walked to the door, her white silk suit catching the light of the hallway. She didn't look back at the office. She didn't look back at the desk where the Morty name had died. She pressed the button for the elevator, the quiet hum of the machinery, a rhythmic promise of what was to come. As the doors opened, she caught her reflection one last time. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a victim, she was the one who gave the order. The elevator descended, but for the first time in a decade, Sophia felt like she was rising. Manhattan lay below her, a grid of endless possibilities, and for the first time, she wasn't building it for someone else. The sole architect was finally home. Story reaches its peak in a sun-drenched Manhattan courtroom, where the atmosphere is thick with the scent of high-stakes justice. The legal outcome is a bloodbath. The judge rules that Julian's covert use of corporate funds to bankroll Arabella's lifestyle and hide her pregnancy constituted a material breach of fiduciary duty. The gavel falls with the weight of a thunderclap, voiding the prenuptial protections Julian relied on and handing the keys to the multi-billion-dollar empire back to Sophia. Sophia's transformation is absolute as she walks past a shell-shocked Julian without a single word. She doesn't need to scream because her silence is her ultimate power. This happy ending isn't about finding a new man, it is the reclamation of her own name and the total, surgical deconstruction of the man who tried to bury her. The narrator leaves the audience with a chilling reminder: never mistake a woman's silence for her surrender. Sophia's journey proves that the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate while they are meticulously documenting your downfall. The very legal system Julian tried to weaponize to strip Sophia of her dignity became the cage that trapped him, proving that in the world of high finance and cold revenge, karma doesn't just come around, it arrives with a subpoena and a frozen bank account. If you enjoyed seeing Julian's empire crumble under the weight of his own arrogance, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and turn on notifications to ensure you never miss a story where the underdog holds all the cards and plays them with deadly precision. We want to hear from you in the comments. Would you have had the patience to wait for the 10th anniversary to strike, or would you have moved against him the moment you found the first receipt?